The situation before government, then, is one where there are no just powers, where no one has the right to command any other. That seems to be the very situation that the Declaration describes when it says that all men are created equal. They are created, or they exist originally or by nature, in a situation of equality with respect to authority, or the right to command. No one has the right to command another except by just power, which derives from the consent of those who are commanded. So created equal in the Declaration means then that there's no political authority except what is consented to. It means, in other words, that originally human beings are conceived to be in a state of nature, as the philosophers preceding Jefferson called it. Why do the Americans believe this, however? It seems so contrary to our normal experience of human life. We are, all of us, or at least most of us, born not into a state of nature, but into a political society, into families which are in societies, and so on. But the text of the Declaration says something actually very surprising if you think about that opening sentence. It says, all men are created equal. That is, all human beings share in this equality, whether they were born 10,000 years ago or just yesterday. Now, the Declaration gives us some help in understanding this odd affirmation of a universal original equality when it pairs the idea of created equal with the idea of being endowed at the beginning with certain inalienable rights, which are identified as rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. It is clear that human beings possess these rights before government is made, because the Declaration tells us that government is made to secure these rights. So they must exist before, they must be insecure before, but they certainly exist. So even in a state of equality or a state of nature, human beings have these rights. Indeed, the Declaration's point seems to be that we know human beings, all human beings, are to be conceived of as created equal because they are endowed with these rights. The equality is an inference from the fact that all human beings possess rights. Now, what can that mean? Let's look at the rights listed. I don't have them up there, but life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. That human beings have these rights means that it is right that they act freely to pursue happiness in their own way, so long as they do not infringe on the rights of others or the needs of society in doing so. Because human beings have these quite comprehensive rights to direct their own lives, they must be conceived of, every one of them, as created equal. That is, as not subject to political authority except what has been consented to. For if they are naturally subject to the rule of others, then they are denied that right of overall self-government or of self-direction that their primary natural rights endow them with. It must follow that nobody has a right to rule others by virtue of any natural claim or inherent quality. Being wiser or stronger or more holy or more virtuous or more industrious, or more reliable, more sensitive, more caring and sharing, a very important one. These may all be admirable qualities, but they are never claims by one human being to rule another without that other's consent. Thus, Thomas Jefferson himself once said of Isaac Newton, who he thought was like the smartest guy that ever lived, that Isaac Newton had no right to rule even the most illiterate and uneducated person without that person's consent. Now, our fathers dedicated their new nation, and it was both a nation and a new nation by virtue of that dedication. And Lincoln seems to mean that the nation is new, not only on this continent, but new to mankind. That seems to be his view. It is the new nation because it is the first nation dedicated to that proposition about equality. That is the proposition about natural rights. America, Lincoln is saying, has added a new chapter to human political history. And that's one of the reasons that winning the Civil War is so important. It's not merely an event in the history of this people in this somewhat out-of-the-way part of the world, but it is an event in all human history, for it's a test of whether any government of this sort can endure. The fate of a whole new kind of human possibility is at stake in this war, and that's why it's so important. Now, in this brief statement that Lincoln gives us, he also refers to liberty. Maybe we could go back to that previous slide of the Declaration. Can you do that? Of the opening sentence. There we are. Great. Lincoln also here refers to liberty, which is often identified with equality as a twin concept of the meaning of the American experience, the meaning of the American enterprise. A nation dedicated to both liberty and equality. But Lincoln tells us not that, but he tells us instead that it is a nation conceived in liberty. A nation conceived in liberty. Now, conceived is itself a very ambiguous term. It can be equivalent roughly to something like thought of or thought up, as when we speak of concepts or conceptions. And no doubt Lincoln means something like that notion of conceived. That is, the nation, he says, was dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, not out of inadvertence, but thoughtfully, that is, meaningfully or intentionally. Likewise, it was not merely conceived or thought up, but it was conceived in liberty, that is, freely, without compulsion. The Americans could have done otherwise, but in their freedom, they dedicated themselves to the equality of human beings in their rights. And their free dedication implies an act of conscious choice and testifies to their judgment of the goodness of their choice. Now, I've so far ignored what I think is the most striking and strange thing about what Lincoln says here, however. He undoubtedly means conceived in the sense that I've just mentioned, but I think he means something else also. This is not merely a nation conceived and dedicated, but it's a nation brought forth upon this continent. Brought forth, or given birth to. It is clear that conceived in this context also means became pregnant with. Lincoln's metaphor is, I think, startling. Our fathers became pregnant and then gave birth to the nation on this continent. The replacement of the mothers by the fathers is easy enough to explain at the most obvious level, being women, both at the time of the founding and in 1863 when Lincoln was speaking, were completely excluded from political life, so, or at least more or less completely shut out. So far as the nation was brought forth then, it was men, males, who did so. That fact does not make the meaning of Lincoln's odd locution any easier to understand, however. Why use the metaphor of pregnancy and birth at all when in the same moment one attributes that to fathers? Lincoln's statement does this strange thing. It both naturalizes the origin of the nation as a kind of birthing, and denatures it at once as a birthing that occurs by fathers, not mothers. It is hard to say which sentiment predominates, the natural or the unnatural. His point in doing so may become visible if we think again of the quotation from the Declaration of Independence that he cites. The proposition that all men are created equal means in itself that there is no natural political authority. Neither God nor nature makes authority or makes political communities. Lincoln carries forward this thought when he attributes the origin of the nature not to God or nature, but to our fathers, that is, to human beings. If, as the Declaration has it, there is no natural authority, if the conceptual beginning point is a state of nature, then political authority must be conceived to begin in consent, or what the philosophers called a social contract. If a nation, as a political community, originates in a contract, in an agreement among men, it is an artifact, a humanly made thing, and not a natural thing, such as comes to be via the natural process of birth. Lincoln's formulation then says that the nation is both a natural and an artificial thing. This ambivalence matches and perhaps reveals the inner meaning of the biological anomaly of Lincoln's fathers getting pregnant and giving birth. Now, to say that the nation comes to be via consent or contract is to say that human beings must be conceived to become part of it through a kind of conscious opting into it of some sort. Political life, which is the sphere of coercion and obligation, is paradoxically a voluntary undertaking. That's the point of saying it derives from consent. That is the American conception to which our fathers were committed. They appealed to that conception at the moment of the birth of their nation because that birth was coincident with their opting out of the political structure and the political authority to which they were obliged at the moment of issuing the Declaration. They do not start out from a state of nature, but from a condition of allegiance to the King of Great Britain.